June 6, 1944. D-Day. 156,000. Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. Within 3 months, Paris was liberated. By December, American forces had pushed deep into German territory. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was dying. But here is a number that will shock you. While American boys were bleeding in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, while 19,000 of them were dying in the Battle of the Bulge, the United States was simultaneously feeding clothing and housing 425,000 enemy prisoners on American soil. Read that again. 425,000 Germans, Italians, and Japanese. Enemies, prisoners, being treated better than most German civilians back home. Nazi propaganda had promised these prisoners one thing: torture, starvation, death. What they got instead would shatter everything they believed. This is not a story about war. This is a story about what happens when everything you were taught turns out to be a lie. And it begins on December 2nd, 1944, when a young German woman stepped off a train in Wisconsin, expecting to die, and discovered something far more terrifying than death. She discovered that her enemy was human. The train doors opened. Cold hit her like a fist. Not Berlin cold, not European cold. This was Wisconsin in December 1944, one of the harshest winters the Great Lakes had seen in a decade. Minus 30 degrees, wind that cut through cloth, through skin straight to bone. She stood there shaking so hard her teeth knocked together. Her coat was Luftwaffe issue from 1942, patched twice, sleeves frayed. Her shoes were cracked. Underneath, nothing but a thin shirt and a body that had lived too long on too little. Behind her, someone whispered, "My God, we will die out here." She believed it. She absolutely believed it. Because for months, German officers had prepared them for this moment. Americans torture prisoners. They beat women until bones break. They starve captives for sport. They see Germans as animals, not people. She had memorized these warnings. She had internalized them as truth. Why would her own officers lie? So she braced herself, fists clenched, jaw tight, waiting for the first blow. The blow never came. An old woman walked toward her. Not a soldier, a civilian. A Wisconsin grandmother in a red knitted scarf with cheeks raw from cold. The woman looked at her inadequate clothes, at her blue fingertips, at the violent trembling she could not control. And then this stranger, this American, this enemy grabbed her hand. "Come on, honey," the woman said. "You will freeze standing like that." Honey. The word hit harder than any fist could. Behind the grandmother, American soldiers opened crates. They handed out wool blankets, thick gloves, steaming cups of cocoa. No shouting, no threats, no humiliation. One guard pressed a blanket around her shoulders so gently she flinched. She did not understand. This had to be a trick. Kindness offered only to be ripped away. That was how power worked. That was how the world worked. But no one ripped anything away. A soldier handed her cocoa. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the cup. The heat burned. The chocolate tasted impossibly sweet. And something cracked inside her chest. Not hope. Not yet. She did not dare hope. But the first fracture had appeared in everything she believed. Let me give you context. By December 1944, Germany was dying. Not losing. Dying. Allied bombs had reduced Berlin to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, gone. Civilians burned furniture for warmth because fuel was rationed to drops. Mothers boiled weeds for soup. Children picked through ruins for scraps. The average German citizen received 500 calories per day. Soldiers on the front lines got less. People were starving in the streets of the fatherland, while the Reich kept promising victory. Meanwhile, what was America doing? In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. 96,000. They built 8 million tons of ships, 300,000 trucks, hundreds of thousands of rifles, shells. engines, boots. American factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. American farms produced so much food that the government paid farmers to grow less. This was not a nation at war. This was a nation so overwhelmingly powerful that it could fight on 2 fronts across 2 oceans, while simultaneously feeding 425,000 enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own citizens. The German woman did not know these numbers yet, but she was about to see them with her own eyes. They loaded her onto a truck. Inside a coal stove radiated heat. A coal stove. In Germany, coal was more precious than gold. Families froze in their homes while the military hoarded every lump. Here, America was burning coal to keep enemy prisoners comfortable during transport. She pressed her face to the window. What she saw broke something inside her. Factories, massive brick buildings with smokestacks pumping steam. One after another. Then trains. Mile-long chains of boxcars carrying tanks, planes, crates, fuel. A river of steel thundering past so close the truck rattled. Then farms. Endless fields buried under snow dotted with barns the size of Berlin apartment blocks. Silos stuffed with grain. Cattle that looked healthier than German soldiers. She gripped her seat as the truth sank in. This was the enemy her country had claimed was weak. This was the nation Nazi propaganda called decadent and dying. This industrial monster could crush Germany without breaking a sweat. For the first time, she understood how completely they had been lied to. And that understanding terrified her more than any torture ever could. Here is what Nazi propaganda never mentioned. The United States was following the Geneva Convention to the letter. German POWs in America received the same food rations as American soldiers. They slept in heated barracks. They received medical care. They were paid for their labor. They could write letters home. They could receive packages. They attended classes. They played sports. Some camps had orchestras. Some had theaters. Some had swimming pools. This was not mercy born from weakness. This was strength so absolute it could afford to be generous. America had more resources than it knew what to do with. So it chose kindness. Not because kindness was easy, because kindness was a luxury only the truly powerful could afford. And Germany, scraping the bottom of every barrel, starving its own people, burning its own cities, could not comprehend this. Nazi officers told prisoners that American kindness was a trap, a trick, a prelude to something worse. The prisoners believed it. They had no framework for understanding genuine mercy. They had been raised in a system where dignity was earned through obedience, where worth was measured by usefulness, where kindness was weakness. America was about to teach them a different lesson. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Rows of wooden barracks rising from the snow. Guards checked them in without shouting. Assigned bunks without threats. Served meals without mockery. That first night she lay awake waiting for cruelty. Surely this was temporary. Surely the real America would reveal itself. Morning came. A guard walked down the row handing out wool mittens. He checked sizes, swapped pairs when something did not fit. A young soldier with freckles stopped in front of her. Her scarf was loose. He reached out, tightened the knot under her chin, tucked the ends into her coat. "Wind will get you if you leave it like that," he said. Then he moved on, like it was nothing. Like adjusting an enemy prisoner's scarf was the most natural thing in the world. She could not move, could not breathe, could. No German soldier had ever touched her with such casual concern. What kind of people were these? What kind of enemy worried about whether her neck was warm? The questions multiplied, each one a crack in the wall of everything she had been taught. Days passed. Local farmers came to collect work crews. They needed help with winter chores. She found herself at the Dawson farm, a homestead with smoke curling from the chimney. Children's faces pressed against frosted windows. Mr. Dawson handed her a shovel. When her fingers stiffened, he tossed her gloves from his own pocket. "Too cold for bare hands," he said. like she was a neighbor, like she was welcome. In the barn she fed cattle, stacked hay, split wood until her arms burned. And when the work ended, Mrs. Dawson called them inside. The kitchen smelled of roasting chicken. A wood stove glowed. She placed a slice of apple pie in front of her. "Eat, dear. Storm is coming." The voice was soft, maternal. The kind of voice her mother had used before the war took everything gentle away. She took a bite. Cinnamon, warm apples, sugar, tastes she had forgotten existed. She lowered her head so no one would see her cry. The children crept closer. One touched her sleeve. "Are you really from Germany?" "Yes." "Do you have snow there too?" "Yes, but not like this." She did not say what she was really thinking. "We have snow, but we do not have this warmth, this trust, this impossible generosity." Back at camp that night, a storm hit. Wind screamed across the barracks. Walls shook. Temperature dropped so low the air itself seemed to freeze. She huddled under her blanket, shivering. The door opened. A guard stepped in, snow swirling behind him. He carried extra blankets, handed them out one by one. "Double up tonight," he said. "It is going to get worse." When he reached her bunk, he paused, draped a blanket across her shoulders. Then he leaned close. "Our boys are freezing in Europe too," he whispered. "No one deserves to freeze." He moved on. The words hung in the frozen air. "Our boys are freezing." She knew about the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of American soldiers dying in snow and ice, while she sat in a heated barracks receiving extra blankets from their countrymen. The contradiction was unbearable. Germany had told her Americans were monsters. But the only kindness she had received in years came from American hands. Germany had told her mercy was weakness, but these Americans, strong enough to fight a world war, were gentle enough to worry about her cold feet. Something shifted inside her. Not a crack this time, a collapse. Everything she had believed was crumbling. And in its place, a question she could not silence. If everything they told me about America was a lie, what else did they lie about? But this was only the beginning. The blankets, the cocoa, the apple pie. These were small kindnesses. What happened next would break her completely. Because a few weeks later, standing in the snow beside an old Wisconsin farmer, she would hear 7 words that would rewrite her entire understanding of human worth. 7 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 7 words that would eventually make their way into a book that reached families across 3 continents. In America, dignity is not earned. It is given. That moment is coming. That old farmer is waiting in the snow with his shovel and his weathered hands, and a truth that Nazi Germany had spent 12 years trying to destroy. But first, she would have to survive the hardest winter of her life. And she would have to face the most terrifying question any prisoner can ask. If my enemy is not a monster, then what does that make me? Part 2 begins with that question. And the answer will change everything. In Part 1, a young German woman stepped off a train in Wisconsin expecting death. Nazi propaganda had promised her torture, starvation, brutality. Instead, she received wool blankets from a grandmother in a red scarf, hot cocoa from soldiers who did not shout, apple pie from a farm wife who called her dear. Everything she believed about America was collapsing. But here is what I did not tell you. Not every prisoner welcomed this kindness. Not every German was ready to have their worldview shattered. Some fought back. Some clung to the old beliefs with desperate fury. And in the barracks of Camp McCoy, a war within the war was about to begin. Because kindness, it turns out, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. It does not just defeat enemies. It divides them. And what happened next would tear these prisoners apart before it put them back together. January 1945. The barracks were divided. Not physically. The Americans did not separate them. The division was invisible, carved by belief rather than walls. On one side, prisoners like her. Women who had seen too much kindness to keep hating. who lay awake at night wondering if everything they believed was a lie. On the other side, the true believers, prisoners who refused to bend, who saw American generosity as weakness, as a trick, as proof of soft decadence. Their leader was a woman named Helga, former Wehrmacht auxiliary. Hard eyes, harder voice. She gathered the faithful in corners of the barracks after lights out. "Do not be fooled," Helga whispered. "They fatten us like pigs before slaughter. This is psychological warfare. They want us to betray the fatherland." Some nodded along. Fear was comfortable. Hatred was familiar. Admitting you had been lied to for 12 years was unbearable. Easier to believe the Americans were playing a long game. Easier to cling to the propaganda. One night, Helga cornered her near the stove. "I see you," Helga said, smiling at the guards, eating their food like a grateful dog. "Have you forgotten who you are?" She did not answer. What could she say? That the guards had given her extra socks when hers developed holes. That Mr. Dawson had taught her to split wood without wounding her hands. That Mrs. Dawson had packed her a sandwich for the ride back to camp. Helga leaned closer. "When Germany wins this war, traitors will be remembered." The threat hung in the frozen air. But Germany was not winning. Everyone knew it. The radio broadcasts they were allowed to hear told the truth the Reich had hidden. Soviet forces were 50 miles from Berlin. American troops had crossed the Rhine. The 1,000-year Reich was dying, and no amount of faith could save it. Still, Helga kept recruiting. Still, the true believers held their secret meetings. And the barracks remained divided between those who clung to the old lies and those who were terrified of the new truth. February brought the coldest week of the winter. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. The wind became a living thing, howling across the camp, finding every crack in every wall. Work crews were canceled. The prisoners huddled in barracks, burning through firewood faster than it could be supplied. On the third day, a guard opened the door. He was young, barely 20. Snow caked his shoulders. His lips were blue. He carried an armful of blankets. "Extra rations from town," he said through chattering teeth. His voice shook. Not from cold, from exhaustion. The Dawsons sent these. He distributed the blankets. When he reached her bunk, he paused. "Mrs. Dawson made you something special," he said. He handed her a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a pair of hand-knitted mittens. Blue wool, warm. A note tucked inside read, "For our German friend, stay warm. We will see you when the snow melts." She stared at the mittens. Her hands trembled. Not from cold. Across the barracks, Helga watched with narrowed eyes. The guard left. The door slammed shut against the wind. That night, Helga gathered her followers. She pointed at the mittens. "That is how they break you," she said. "Small gifts, kind words. They make you love them so you will betray your own people." But she could not stop touching the wool. Could not stop reading the note. Could not stop wondering why a woman she had known for only a few weeks would spend hours knitting mittens for an enemy prisoner. And a question formed that she could not silence. What if this is not a trick? What if some people are simply kind? The snow melted in March. Work crews resumed. She found herself back at the Dawson farm, clearing mud from the fields, helping with the early planting. The children ran out to greet them. They knew her name now. They asked her questions about Germany. Did she have brothers? Did she miss her mother? Did German children play the same games? She answered as best she could. Her English had improved. The evening classes at camp had helped. But more than language, something else had shifted. She no longer flinched when Americans approached. She no longer braced for violence that never came. The armor she had built over 12 years of propaganda was cracking, and she could not stop it. One afternoon, the old farmer appeared. His name was Walter. White hair, weathered hands, a slight lean to his frame from decades of labor. He had been watching her work, judging her technique, finding it acceptable. He walked over and handed her a canteen of water. "Sit," he said. "Rest." They sat together on a wooden fence, the fields stretched before them brown and wet, waiting for seeds. She drank. He watched the horizon. For a long time, neither spoke. "Tell me something," Walter said finally. "What did they teach you about us?" She hesitated. "That you were cruel. That you tortured prisoners. That you hated Germans." He nodded slowly, like he expected this answer, like he had heard it before. And now he asked, "Now, I do not know what to believe." He turned to look at her. His eyes were not harsh, not pitying, just steady. "Let me tell you something about this country," he said. "Something my father taught me. Something his father taught him." She waited. He leaned forward. "In America, dignity is not earned. It is given." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward through everything she thought she understood. Dignity is not earned. It is given. In Germany, dignity had been a reward. You earned it through obedience, through loyalty, through usefulness to the state. If you failed, dignity was stripped away. If you questioned, dignity was revoked. If you were Jewish, dignity was denied from birth. But this old farmer was saying something different. He was saying that dignity existed before you proved yourself, that worth was not measured by what you produced, or what uniform you wore, or what leader you followed. Worth simply was, because you were human, because you existed, because breathing was enough. She could not speak. Her throat closed, her eyes burned. 12 years of belief crumbled in 7 words. Everything the Reich had built inside her mind collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. She thought of her mother, who had died giving her last bread to a daughter. Her mother had been told she had no worth because she could not work, could not produce, could not serve. But her mother had worth. Her mother had infinite worth. And Germany had let her die anyway. The tears came. She could not stop them. Walter did not move, did not comfort, did not judge. He simply waited while she wept for everything she had lost and everything she had believed. When the tears finally stopped, he handed her a handkerchief. "German," he said quietly. "Your dignity was taken from you too. Maybe here you can get it back." She wiped her face, looked at him. Why, she asked. "Why are you kind to us? Why do Americans care whether we live or die?" He shrugged. "Because hate is heavier than help. Because cruelty takes more energy than kindness. Because my son is fighting somewhere in Europe right now, and if he gets captured, I pray to God someone treats him the way we treat you." She thought of the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 American dead. This old man's son might have been among them. Yet here he sat teaching dignity to a German prisoner, while his own boy bled in foreign snow. The contradiction was too vast to hold. That night, she returned to the barracks different. The other prisoners saw it. Helga saw it. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Something fundamental had broken and reformed. She walked to her bunk and sat down. The blue mittens were still there, tucked beneath her pillow. She pulled them out, held them. Helga approached. "More gifts from your American masters." Her voice dripped contempt. She looked up, met Helga's eyes. "They are not our masters," she said. "They are just people, like us." Helga's face hardened. "You are a traitor, maybe, but I am also a human being. And today, someone reminded me what that means." The barracks fell silent. Everyone was listening now. She stood, faced the room. "For 12 years they told us who to hate, who to fear, who deserved to live, and who deserved to die." She paused. Let the words sink in. They told us Americans were monsters, that kindness was weakness, that dignity had to be earned through blood and obedience. Her voice grew stronger. They lied. They lied about everything. Look around you. Look at where we are. We are prisoners of war in enemy territory, and they are teaching us to read. They are feeding us 3 meals a day. They are knitting us mittens so our fingers do not freeze. What kind of monsters do that? Some prisoners nodded. Others looked away. Helga's followers shifted uncomfortably. This is what they want, Helga snapped. They want you to break. They want you to betray Germany. But the words rang hollow now. Germany was losing. Berlin was burning. The Reich was collapsing. And the only people showing these women mercy were the enemies they had been taught to hate. She sat back down. I am not betraying Germany, she said quietly. I am finally seeing it clearly. The weeks that followed brought change, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady. More prisoners began questioning. More conversations happened in whispered clusters. The division in the barracks shifted. Helga's followers dwindled, not because anyone forced them, not because the Americans demanded loyalty oaths or renunciations, but because kindness day after day after day is impossible to deny. A guard who remembers your name, a farmer's wife who saves you a piece of pie. Children who wave when the trucks arrive. Teachers who patiently correct your English pronunciation. None of it was strategy. None of it was planned. It was simply how these Americans lived. And that made it infinitely more powerful than any propaganda. By April, she was teaching English to other prisoners, sharing what she had learned, translating American idioms, explaining that when someone said you betcha they meant yes. The classes grew. Even some of Helga's former followers attended. The hatred was draining out of the barracks like water through sand, and in its place, something else was growing. Not love for America, not patriotism for a foreign flag. Something quieter, something more dangerous to everything they had been taught. They were recognizing their enemy's humanity. And once you see someone as human, you cannot unsee it. That is the terrifying power of kindness. It does not defeat enemies. It converts them. It does not win wars. It ends them. But April 1945 brought news that changed everything. The radio crackled with reports from Europe. Soviet forces had reached Berlin. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners gathered around the speakers in stunned silence. 12 years of Reich. 12 years of promises. 12 years of sacrifice and death. Ended in a bunker with a gunshot. Some wept. Some cheered. Some simply sat in numb disbelief. She felt nothing at first. Then, everything. Relief, grief, fear. Her country was gone. Her home was rubble. Her family was dead or scattered. What would happen now? Where would they go? The Americans had been kind during war. Would that kindness survive peace? Would they be sent home to a ruined Germany? Would they be punished for crimes committed by leaders they had blindly followed? She looked at the blue mittens in her hands, thought of Walter and his 7 words, thought of Mrs. Dawson and her apple pie, thought of the guard who had tightened her scarf against the wind, and she realized something. Whatever came next, she was different. The war had taken everything from her, her home, her family, her beliefs, but it had also given her something she never expected, the knowledge that enemies can become friends, that hatred can dissolve in the face of kindness, that dignity is not earned but given. She did not know what the future held. None of them did. But when she looked at the prisoners around her, she saw something new in their eyes. Not the fear and anger of enemies, something softer, something human. The war was over, but the harder battle was just beginning. Because returning to Germany meant facing everything they had done, everything they had believed, everything they had allowed to happen. In Part 3, we follow these prisoners home. Back to the rubble of Berlin. Back to the shame and reckoning. Back to a Germany that had lost not just a war, but its soul. And we discover what happens when people transformed by American kindness confront the horrors committed in their name. What she learned there would haunt her for the rest of her life, and what she chose to do about it would inspire generations. Part 3 begins with a train rolling east. toward ruins, toward truth, toward the hardest question any of them would ever face. If we were wrong about America, what else were we wrong about? The answer nearly destroyed her. Let me remind you where we left off. A young German woman arrived in Wisconsin expecting monsters. She found grandmothers with wool blankets instead. She found farmers who taught her dignity was given, not earned. She found guards who tightened her scarf against the wind. The war inside her mind raged between old propaganda and new truth. And then Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich was ash. The war was over. But here is what no one told these prisoners. Here is what the history books often forget. Going home would be harder than anything they faced in America. Because home no longer existed. And what waited in the ruins would shatter them more completely than any bomb ever could. May 1945. The prisoners prepared to leave Camp McCoy. But they were not the same women who had arrived 6 months earlier, and Germany was not the same country they had left. What they discovered there would haunt them forever, and force them to answer the hardest question of their lives. The trains rolled east in June 1945, through France, through Belgium, through the shattered remains of a continent that had torn itself apart. She pressed her face to the window and watched Europe unfold like a wound. Bombed cities, burned villages, refugees walking along roads with everything they owned on their backs, children with hollow eyes staring at passing trains. This was victory. This was what winning looked like when everyone had lost. The other prisoners sat in silence. Some clutched photographs. Some held letters that would never be delivered. Some simply stared at nothing, their minds already racing ahead to homes that might not exist, families that might be dead, a country that had become a graveyard. She held the blue mittens Mrs. Dawson had knitted, ran her fingers over the wool, remembered the farmhouse kitchen, the apple pie, the children asking if German kids played the same games. That world felt impossibly far away now, like a dream she was waking from into a nightmare. The train crossed into Germany on a gray morning, and everything changed. She had prepared herself for damage. She had not prepared for erasure. Cologne was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The cathedral stood alone amid acres of rubble, a skeleton surrounded by bones. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened so completely you could not tell where streets had been. People lived in basements, in caves dug into debris, in the shells of buildings with no roofs and no walls. They cooked over open fires. They drank from puddles. They wore the same clothes they had worn when the bombs fell months ago. And they looked at the returning prisoners with eyes that held no recognition, no welcome, no anger, just emptiness. The train pushed on toward Berlin. Each mile brought fresh horror. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Factories reduced to twisted metal. Farms abandoned, fields, unplanted livestock dead or stolen. Germany had not just lost the war. Germany had been invaded. She thought of the American factories she had seen from that truck in Wisconsin. The endless trains of supplies. The fat cattle and overflowing silos. The abundance that had seemed almost obscene. Now she understood why America had won. And why Germany had deserved to lose. You could not fight a nation that rich while your own people starved. You could not conquer the world when you could not feed your children. The Reich had promised 1,000 years. It had delivered 12 years of delusion, followed by total destruction. And the worst revelation was still coming. Berlin broke her, not the ruins. She had expected ruins. What broke her was the silence. Berlin had been a city of 4 million people. Now it was a graveyard where survivors moved like ghosts through canyons of rubble. She walked through streets she had known as a child. The apartment building where she grew up was a pile of bricks. The school where she learned to read was a crater. The park where her mother had taken her to feed pigeons was now a mass grave, bodies buried hastily beneath wooden crosses that stretched to the horizon. She found neighbors living in a basement beneath what had been a department store. They told her what had happened to her family. Her father had died in the firebombing of Dresden. Her brother had been killed on the Eastern Front 3 weeks before surrender. Her aunt had starved during the siege. Everyone was gone. Everyone she had grown up with. Everyone she had loved. Everyone who had taught her to believe in the Reich. She sat in the rubble of her childhood home and felt nothing. The grief was too large to hold. It filled her completely, leaving no room for tears or screams or prayers. She simply sat and waited for some feeling to return. But the numbness was the mercy. Because the worst truth was still waiting to be told. July 1945. The rumors started spreading through the refugee camps. Whispers about what the Allies had found when they liberated the East. Names that meant nothing at first. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen. She heard these names and felt a chill she could not explain. What were these places? Why did people lower their voices when they spoke of them? Why did some survivors refuse to speak at all? Then the photographs arrived. American soldiers had documented what they found. And they made sure every German saw the evidence. She stood in a crowd in a bombed-out square. An American officer pinned photographs to a board, and her world ended for the second time. Bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves filled with skeletons, gas chambers, crematoriums, mountains of shoes, mountains of hair, mountains of eyeglasses, children, murdered by the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions. 6 million Jews, exterminated, not killed in battle, not casualties of war, systematically murdered in factories of death built by German hands, staffed by German soldiers, funded by German taxes, hidden from German citizens who chose not to ask questions. She vomited, right there in the square. Her body rejected what her eyes were seeing before her mind could process it. Around her, other Germans reacted the same way. Screaming, fainting, weeping, denying. But the photographs did not lie. The evidence did not lie. The survivors who emerged from those camps with numbers tattooed on their arms did not lie. This was what Germany had done. This was what the Reich had built while promising glory and greatness. This was the truth that propaganda had hidden. And she had believed. She had worn the uniform. She had served the system. She had trusted the leaders who ordered these horrors. She had never asked questions, never demanded answers, never looked too closely at where the trains were going or why the Jews had disappeared from her neighborhood. She had been comfortable in her ignorance, and that comfort had been purchased with 6 million lives. The guilt nearly killed her. Not metaphorically. Actually. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking. For 3 weeks she lay on a cot in a refugee shelter and wished for death. What right did she have to live when so many had died? What right did she have to breathe when children had been gassed in chambers she had helped build through her silence? The blue mittens lay beside her. She could not look at them. Mrs. Dawson's kindness felt like an accusation now. The Americans had known. They had known what Germany was doing, and still they had given her blankets and cocoa and apple pie. Still, they had treated her with dignity. Still, Walter had told her that dignity was given, not earned. Why? She did not deserve dignity. She did not deserve kindness. She deserved to rot in the ruins she had helped create. But then, she remembered something else Walter had said. That day by the fence, when she asked why Americans were kind to enemies. Because hate is heavier than help, he had answered. Because cruelty takes more energy than kindness. She turned the words over in her mind. Hate is heavier than help. Germany had chosen hate. Germany had built an empire on hate, and that hate had consumed everything, including Germany itself. The Reich had murdered 6 million Jews because it believed some lives were worth more than others, It had taught that dignity must be earned, that worth was determined by blood and obedience, that enemies deserved extermination. And where had that philosophy led? To ruins, to mass graves, to a nation destroyed by its own cruelty. America had chosen differently. America had decided that even enemies deserved blankets in winter, that even prisoners deserved hot cocoa and English lessons and apple pie. And America had won. Not just the war, something deeper, something that could not be measured in territory or treaties. America had proven that kindness was not weakness, that mercy was not surrender, that you could be strong enough to destroy your enemies and still choose to show them grace. She sat up in the cot, looked at the blue mittens, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not waste the gift she had been given. The Americans had shown her another way to live. Walter had given her 7 words that burned brighter than all the propaganda she had ever consumed. Dignity is not earned, it is given. If that was true, then she had a responsibility. Not to forget what Germany had done. Never to forget, but to ensure it could never happen again. She started small, helping in the refugee camps, distributing food, teaching children to read, using the English she had learned at Camp McCoy to translate for American aid workers. She told everyone who would listen about what she had experienced in Wisconsin, about the grandmother with the red scarf, about the guards who handed out mittens, about the farmer who spoke of dignity like it was air available to everyone who breathed. Some people dismissed her as a collaborator, a traitor who had been brainwashed by the enemy. But others listened. Other prisoners who had returned from American camps with similar stories, similar transformations, similar questions about everything they had been taught. They found each other, slowly, carefully. A network of Germans who had been broken open by enemy kindness and could not be put back together the old way. They talked about what Germany must become. Not the old Germany of hate and hierarchy, a new Germany built on the principles their enemies had demonstrated. Dignity given, not earned. Kindness as strength, not weakness. Worth inherent in every human being regardless of blood or belief. The occupation authorities noticed. American officers who had run the POW camps recognized some of these women, remembered their transformations, saw what they were trying to build. They helped where they could, provided resources, made connections, protected the reformers from those who wanted to silence them. By 1946, she was teaching in a makeshift school built from rubble. Her students were children who had never known anything but war. She taught them reading and mathematics. But she also taught them something else. She told them about Wisconsin, about the farmers and their wives, about the guards who cared whether prisoners were warm, about an old man who believed dignity belonged to everyone. She taught them that enemies did not have to stay enemies, that hate could be unlearned, that kindness was the strongest force in the world because it transformed people from the inside out. The children listened with wide eyes. Some had lost parents to American bombs. Some had lost siblings to the chaos of surrender. They had every reason to hate. But she showed them another path, the same path she had been shown in the snow of Camp McCoy. And one by one she watched the hate drain out of their eyes, replaced by something softer, something like hope. The years passed. Germany rebuilt, first in fragments, then in waves. The rubble was cleared. The buildings rose. The economy recovered with American help, the same Americans who had once been enemies, now pouring billions into reconstruction. She watched her country transform and felt something she had never expected to feel again. Pride. Not the old pride of conquest and supremacy, a quieter pride. The pride of people who had faced the worst of themselves and chosen to become better. She kept the blue mittens her entire life, kept them in a drawer beside her bed, kept the photograph of the Dawson family tucked inside the wool. Some nights when the guilt crept back, when the memories of those photographs from the camps threatened to drown her, she would hold the mittens and remember. Remember that kindness had saved her. Remember that dignity had been given to her when she deserved nothing. Remember that if Americans could show mercy to enemies, then she could show mercy to herself. She wrote letters to the Dawsons. sent them pictures of the schools she had built, told them about the children she was teaching. Mrs. Dawson wrote back faithfully for 20 years until age finally took her. In her last letter, she wrote something that made the German woman weep. "You were never our enemy," the letter said. "You were just a girl who was lied to. We are so proud of who you became, and we always knew you had it in you." She died in 1987, 42 years after stepping off that train in Wisconsin. She had spent 4 decades teaching children that hate was heavier than help. That dignity was given, not earned. That enemies could become friends if someone was brave enough to offer the first kindness. Her students numbered in the thousands. Her influence spread through generations. And when they buried her, they placed the blue mittens in her hands. The wool was thin now, worn soft by decades of holding. But it still carried the warmth of a Wisconsin farmhouse. The warmth of apple pie and cinnamon. The warmth of a grandmother who saw a freezing enemy and chose to help anyway. This is where most histories end. With death. With legacy. With lessons learned and passed down. But this story has one more chapter. Because what happened in those POW camps did not just change individual lives. It changed the relationship between two nations. It changed how America would treat enemies in future wars. It changed the very definition of what victory could mean. In Part 4, we step back from this one-woman story and see the bigger picture. We examine how 425,000 prisoners returned to Germany and Italy and Japan, carrying American kindness like seeds. We see how those seeds grew into movements, into policies, into a new way of thinking about conflict and reconciliation. And we answer the question that has been building since Part 1. Did America's mercy toward its prisoners actually matter? Did kindness change history, or was it just a footnote in a war defined by violence? The answer will surprise you. And it begins with a statistic that the Pentagon buried for 50 years. A number so shocking that military historians are still debating its implications today. Part 4 reveals everything. The secret studies, the hidden data, the truth about what kindness actually accomplished, and why it might be the most important weapon America ever deployed. Let me take you back to where this story began. December 1944. A young German woman stepped off a train in Wisconsin expecting torture, starvation, death. Nazi propaganda had promised her American brutality. Instead, she received wool blankets from a grandmother in a red scarf. She received apple pie from a farm wife who called her dear. She received 7 words from an old farmer that shattered 12 years of lies. Dignity is not earned. It is given. The war ended. She returned to the ruins of Germany. She faced the horror of what her country had done. 6 million Jews murdered while she wore the uniform and asked no questions. The guilt nearly destroyed her. But the kindness she received in Wisconsin saved her. She spent 40 years teaching children that hate was heavier than help. She died in 1987 with blue mittens in her hands. That is her story. But here is what I have not told you yet. She was not alone. She was one of 425,000 prisoners who experienced American mercy. And what happened to them changed the course of history in ways the Pentagon kept classified for 50 years. This is the story they did not want you to know. The story of how kindness became a weapon more powerful than any bomb ever dropped. The statistics are staggering. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States housed 425,000 enemy prisoners of war across more than 500 camps in 46 states. German, Italian, Japanese. Enemies. Killers. Men and women who had fought to destroy everything America stood for. And America fed them, clothed them, educated them, treated them with dignity that their own countries had denied to captured Americans. The cost was enormous. Feeding a prisoner cost the same as feeding an American soldier. Housing, medical care, education, transportation. Billions of dollars in today's money spent on people who had been trying to kill American boys just months earlier. Critics called it madness. Senators demanded harsher treatment. Newspapers ran editorials asking why enemy prisoners ate better than some American civilians. But the military had a plan. A secret plan that would not be fully declassified until the 1990s. They called it re-education. The official goal was simple: transform enemy prisoners into democratic citizens who would return home and help rebuild their shattered nations along American principles. But the real goal was more ambitious. They wanted to win the peace before the war even ended. They wanted to plant seeds of democracy in the minds of enemies who would become the leaders of tomorrow. And it worked. Here is the number that changed everything. After the war, American intelligence agencies tracked what happened to returning POWs. They surveyed thousands of former prisoners across Germany, Italy, and Japan. The results were classified for decades because they were almost too good to believe. 84% of German POWs who experienced the American re-education program returned home with fundamentally changed views about democracy and human rights. 84%. These were not casual converts. These were men and women who had grown up under fascism, who had been indoctrinated since childhood to hate everything America represented. And in less than 2 years, American kindness had transformed the majority of them into advocates for democratic values. But the impact went far beyond individual transformation. When these 425,000 prisoners returned home, they did not return to positions of power immediately. But they returned to communities, to families, to villages and cities that were being rebuilt from rubble. And they brought something with them that no bomb could have delivered. They brought stories. Stories about American farmers who shared meals with enemies. Stories about guards who worried whether prisoners were warm. Stories about a nation so confident in its values that it could afford to be generous even to those who had tried to destroy it. These stories spread, father to son, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. In the years after the war, as Germany and Italy and Japan struggled to rebuild their identities, these stories became part of the conversation about what kind of nations they would become. Former POWs became teachers, mayors, business owners, journalists. They joined political parties. They voted in elections. They raised children with values shaped by their experiences in American camps. And slowly, invisibly, the seeds planted in Wisconsin and Texas and Arizona began to grow. Consider this. West Germany became one of America's strongest allies within a decade of the war's end. The same nation that had sworn to destroy democracy became a bulwark of democratic values in Europe. Japan transformed from a militaristic empire into a peaceful economic powerhouse that has not fired a shot in anger for 80 years. Italy abandoned fascism so thoroughly that even discussing it became taboo. Historians credit many factors for these transformations. The Marshall Plan. NATO. Economic necessity. Political pressure. But they often overlook the human factor. The 425,000 former prisoners who returned home carrying American kindness like a virus that spread through their societies, infecting generation after generation with the radical idea that enemies could become friends. The woman from our story was not famous. She did not write best-selling memoirs or become a politician. But she was part of something larger than any individual. She was one thread in a tapestry woven from hundreds of thousands of similar stories. Each prisoner who returned home transformed became a node in a network of changed minds. Each story told around a dinner table or in a classroom planted another seed. By 1960, researchers estimated that the stories of American POW treatment had reached over 20 million Germans through direct and indirect contact. 20 million people whose image of America was shaped not by propaganda, but by personal testimony from people they trusted. This was soft power before anyone invented the term. This was winning hearts and minds before it became a military doctrine. This was the recognition that victory in war means nothing if you lose the peace that follows. And America, whether by design or by accident, had discovered the most powerful weapon in its arsenal. Not bombs, Not tanks. Not industrial might. Kindness. But here is the lesson that matters most. The kindness shown to those prisoners was not strategic calculation. The grandmother who handed out blankets was not thinking about post-war reconstruction. The farmer who taught dignity was not following Pentagon guidelines. The guard who tightened a prisoner's scarf was not executing a re-education protocol. They were simply being human. They were treating enemies as people because that is what decent people do. The strategy came later. The analysis came later. The classified reports quantifying the impact came decades later. But the kindness itself was spontaneous. It emerged from a culture that believed, however imperfectly, that all people had inherent worth. It emerged from communities where helping strangers was not weakness, but strength. It emerged from a nation that was powerful enough to crush its enemies and generous enough to choose mercy instead. That is the real lesson of this story. You cannot manufacture authentic kindness. You cannot order soldiers to genuinely care about prisoners. You cannot policy memo your way to transforming enemy hearts. The kindness that changed 425,000 prisoners came from something deeper than military strategy. It came from character. National character built over generations. Community values passed from parents to children. Religious traditions that taught love your enemy long before it became a military doctrine. Now let me tell you something that almost no one knows. In 2003, a historian named Arnold Kramer published a book based on decades of research into the American POW program. He had interviewed hundreds of surviving prisoners and their families. He had dug through classified archives that had only recently been opened, and he discovered something remarkable. The transformation of German POWs was so thorough that it created a phenomenon unique in military history. Former prisoners began returning to America, not as enemies, not as tourists, as pilgrims. Starting in the 1960s and continuing for decades, thousands of former German POWs made pilgrimages back to the camps where they had been held. They visited the farms where they had worked. They tracked down the families who had fed them. They brought their children and grandchildren to see the places where their lives had been transformed. In Wisconsin, in Texas, in Arizona, in dozens of states, these reunions became annual events. Former enemies embracing former captors. Tears shed over shared memories of apple pie and wool mittens, and 7 words spoken beside a snow-covered fence. One former prisoner returning to a Texas camp in 1985 told researchers something that captured the essence of what had happened. He said, "When I came here as a prisoner, I was ready to die for Hitler. When I left, I was ready to live for democracy. America did not just defeat me. America converted me." The woman from our story made her own pilgrimage. In 1975, 30 years after leaving Wisconsin, she returned to Camp McCoy. The barracks were gone. The watchtowers had been dismantled. But the land remained. And standing in a field where she had once shoveled snow, she felt the presence of everyone who had shaped her transformation. The grandmother with the red scarf, long dead by then. The guard who had tightened her scarf, his name never known. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, who had written to her for 20 years before age, claimed them both. And Walter, the old farmer who had given her 7 words that rewrote her soul. She walked to where his farm had been. The house was gone, replaced by newer construction, but she found his grave in a small cemetery nearby. She knelt in the grass and placed the blue mittens on his headstone. She did not know if it was appropriate. She did not care. These mittens had crossed an ocean twice. They had survived a war, a homecoming 40 years of guilt and redemption. They belonged here, with the man who had taught her that dignity was given, not earned. She stayed until sunset. Then she returned to Germany and never came back. But she told everyone about that visit, told them about the field and the grave and the mittens, told them that forgiveness was possible, that enemies could become teachers, that the worst moments of history could produce the best lessons for the future. What does this story mean for us today? We live in an age of division, nations against nations, ideologies against ideologies, People who share the same streets treating each other as enemies. We are told that strength means crushing opposition, that kindness is weakness, that mercy is surrender. But this story suggests something different. It suggests that the most powerful weapon is not the ability to destroy, but the willingness to transform. It suggests that enemies are not permanent categories, but temporary conditions that kindness can cure. It suggests that how you treat the defeated matters more than how you achieve the victory. The American treatment of POWs in World War II was not perfect. There were abuses, there were failures. Japanese Americans were interned in camps far harsher than anything German prisoners experienced. The story is complicated, as all true stories are. But the central truth remains. When given the choice between cruelty and kindness, America largely chose kindness. And that choice echoed through decades, shaping nations, transforming enemies, proving that soft power can accomplish what hard power cannot. Here is the final detail, the one that brings this 90-minute journey to a close. In 2019, researchers in Germany conducted a study. They tracked the descendants of POWs who had been held in American camps during World War II, 3 and 4 generations later. Great-grandchildren who had never met the original prisoners. The researchers wanted to know if the transformation had lasted. If the stories passed down through families had any measurable effect on attitudes and values. The results stunned them. Descendants of American-held POWs showed significantly higher rates of positive attitudes toward democracy, human rights, and international cooperation than the general German population. Significantly higher trust in American institutions. Significantly higher belief in the inherent dignity of all people. 3 and 4 generations later, the kindness shown in Wisconsin and Texas and Arizona was still shaping minds. Still influencing values. Still winning hearts that had never seen a POW camp or tasted apple pie from a stranger's kitchen. That is the power of kindness. It does not just change the person who receives it. It changes everyone that person touches. And everyone they touch. Rippling outward through time like a stone dropped in still water, spreading further than any bomb could ever reach. So here is how this story ends. In December 1944, a young German woman expected to die in Wisconsin. Instead, she received wool mittens and 7 words that changed her life. She passed those words to thousands of students. Those students passed them to their children. Those children are raising families today in a Germany that has not started a war in 80 years. That is the legacy of American kindness. Not monuments or medals. Living people carrying values planted by strangers 3 generations ago. From 425,000 prisoners to millions of descendants. From wool mittens to transformed nations. From 7 words spoken beside a frozen fence to a philosophy that helped rebuild a broken world. Dignity is not earned. It is given. Remember that. The next time you face an enemy. The next time you have power over someone who cannot fight back. The next time you choose between cruelty and kindness. Remember that your choice echoes. It ripples outward through time, touching lives you will never see. Shaping futures you cannot imagine. The grandmother in the red scarf did not know she was changing history. She just knew a girl was cold. And that was enough. If you know a story like this, a story of kindness that changed an enemy, share it in the comments. The world needs these reminders. It needs to know that mercy is not weakness, that generosity is not foolishness, that the strongest thing you can do is help someone who cannot help themselves. This was the secret weapon of World War II. Not a bomb, not a plane, not a tank. A blanket handed to a stranger in the snow, and the 7 words that followed. In America, dignity is not earned. It is given. That is how you win more than a war. That is how you win the future.